before I forget, man, I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action. Then he finally answered. "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I'd been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, to put it politely. Feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, well, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late-night drive and ended up getting turned around on all these 2-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so he and I could both see it before continuing. "So, I was hoping you could point out on here roughly where we are, and more importantly, the way to get back to the main road." There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh, softly at first and then louder. "Dude, a paper map?" he managed out between wheezes. "Are you for real? What year do you think this is, 1993? For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I'd had a bad feeling I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I'd been proven correct. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. "Seriously, bro, don't you have GPS in your car or something?" he asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing out the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. "Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me out the door, I could see he wanted to make another quip, probably something about how I should buy a newer car or something. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over the map and, still chuckling softly to himself, began looking at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. "Ha! I still got it!" he said proudly, then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. "We're right about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles outside Placer." I leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. "Here?" He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, then examined the map further. "Okay, so it seems I could take more than a few roads to get back to Interstate 5, right?" The kid nodded again, clearly already bored with the unusual interaction by the slightly annoyed look which had begun to cross his face. "Sure," he said simply, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. "That'll be $14.50 for this and $28.50 for the gas." I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. "Thanks for the help," I said as I turned to head out the door. "Yeah, no problem." I heard him mutter at me as I crossed to the front door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jangled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around the store, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of the lights over the pumps. The sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to be an elk. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps for my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. "So, did you find out where we are?" asked a voice from the passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. It was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. "Dude, were you in there that long that you forgot I was out here waiting for you?" Not wanting to admit I had done just that, I shook my head. "Nah, bro, not that. Just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache." He nodded sympathetically. Craig was one of my close friends. Ever since we'd met each other, we'd immediately clicked and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing we both loved to do was take late-night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This is the first time we've ever gotten lost, though. I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. "Here," I said simply, before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the back seat. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it, the car's buzzer sounding as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline four quietly rumbled to life with its traditional burble. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store and froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door and staring out at us. What the actual hell? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. Dude, what the hell is his problem? I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit, then placed it back in its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. I don't know, but honestly, man, that's more than a bit creepy. I shot one last glance. The kid hadn't even blinked once. He was just staring with an off-putting intensity out the glass. "Come on, let's get out of here," Craig said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch, the car beginning to roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. "Prick," I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way we came. Well, the good thing is, yeah, I did find out where we are. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment, and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. "Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer?" he asked with a slightly astonished tone. "Longer drive than normal, I guess," I answered, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my smoke out. I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45, it read. I let out a small sigh. Great, Vanessa is likely worrying up a storm about us right now. Me especially. Ever since we'd started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long, late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared I'd get into an accident, either with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time, I'd come home to find her sitting up waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lip slightly. "Hey, you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're okay?" I asked Craig. I heard him let out a snort. "Honestly, bro, no. I know the woman loves you to death, and I'm happy she cares so much, but she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you two need your space. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together." I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. "It's called being in love, dude. You should try it sometime," I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. "Nah, thanks. I enjoy being single too much." Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up on me as I watched the two-lane road stretch out before us, the moon in the sky almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. "Well, what'd you expect, Derek? You drove into the boonies. There's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time?" Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled in the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance with the Dead's That House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. "Dude, yes! That's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this." He rolled down the passenger window, sticking his head out the window to whoop and holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat, the tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went. The road stretching out ahead of us and then disappearing into the blackness behind us, the music blasting out from the radio and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read 5 minutes to 3. We should be at the highway in a minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body and fumbled into the back seat for the bag, catching it with the tips of my fingers. I pulled my bottle of soda from it and, holding the bottle to the steering wheel, cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road and nearly spit it all out onto the windshield. In the second I'd stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. "Fucking hell!" I shouted, jamming my feet on the brake and clutch as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up, and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. To my horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. Oh, hell, no, 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 no! For a few seconds, the world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment we'd smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way we'd come. I could tell from the black lines on the road, which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripped the steering wheel with almost a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds, before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. "Dude, what the fuck?" He shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt, and practically kicked the door open. Stepping out onto the pavement, I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlight beams. I looked around, first at the road ahead, then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me, over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, it was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No, I know for a fact I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opening made me turn, seeing Craig step out of the car. Leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. "You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the hell just happened before I lose it, bro," he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice, then I answered. "Someone. Dude, I'm not crazy. Someone stepped out of the woods and onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought I was gonna freaking hit her." I realized I'd been holding in a breath and let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. "You serious, man?" I nodded. He pulled the flashlight he'd used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree line on one side of the road, then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. "Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore." His brow furrowed. "But why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere?" he muttered, more to himself than me. I still answered, "I don't know, man. It's freaking Josephine County. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos." I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter and reply, but something had caught my attention. A feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there. But the feeling remained, and I didn't like it one bit. Especially when the feeling came again, this time from the direction I'd just been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with the flicker of fear. "Oh, shit," I whispered. Craig turned to look at me. "What?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. He repeated, "What?" I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of a weak voice. "Let's get back in the car right now." He didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified. As if someone were rapidly approaching from the woods. Oh, hell. I broke, first into a run, then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Craig do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. "What the hell was that, man?" The tone of it gave away the fact he'd felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread and fear I'd had. "You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have someone step into the road and get them to stop?" I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought. "And then a bunch of people spring out of the woods trying to ambush them." "Oh, hell no." My thoughts exactly. Time to friggin' leave. I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later, we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. "I think we're in the clear, man." Craig let out a soft laugh. "Thank fuck for that." I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let a laugh of my own. "I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this, I may take a bit of a break from late-night drives for a bit. This just got under my skin too much." For a few moments, longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered. "As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all." I thought I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else I couldn't place, but then I heard him sit up straight. "Hey, Jake?" he asked, a bit of a concerned tone now etched into it. "Yeah?" I heard him draw another breath. Shouldn't we be to the highway by now? Or at least see the lights of passing cars?" I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road in my headlights, but at his words, I jerked my head to look beyond them. What the actual hell? He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the dark. I clearly remembered looking in my side view mirror as we turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glows zipping by both ways at close to the same distance we were now. That wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness. Darkness, and the woods on either side of the road. For a moment I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirred. He's gotta be mistaken. Hell, I've gotta be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they first look. Feeling somewhat relieved by the thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. And for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if seeing the woman step in the road had shaken me more than I'd first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 55 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence. And then Craig let out a cry. "There! A light!" For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me, and I craned over the steering wheel, looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it was only a streetlight, standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old worn sign which seemed to have been shot at many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car some as it came towards us so I could read it, and felt a wave of confusion fall over me. Golden. 2 miles. The fuck? Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the streetlight momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on his face. How the hell did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town, one which attracts visitors every year to check out the standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people, but once the prospects dried up in the early to mid-20th century, it became the ghost town it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays was being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer him. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freaking way. Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas, from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. I honestly don't know, man. I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turn-off for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark, hulking shape of the church's spire rising out of the dark for a moment. Then it was behind us. The lighter popped out, and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided I needed to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is, we can't be far now from the highway. So let's just keep our wits about us, keep calm, and when we get back to my place, you, me, and Vanessa can have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath, then let it out in a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. Glad I've got you. I nodded, then realized he may not be able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I'd last looked at it, and yet it felt more like it'd been 30. Time seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes there was only darkness. And then, a light appeared in the distance. "Ha! There we go!" I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign for the on-ramp appear, and felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by again. That's... what? Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing he'd seen it as well. As the streetlight and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling I'd had when we'd gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one out there. The turnoff for the ghost town approached again. I heard Craig let out another deep breath. "Derek, pull over, please," he said simply. His voice was shaking, and as much as I didn't want to stop, I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turnoff. He ripped his seatbelt off, shoving the door open and stepping out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle when I glanced at the clock, and froze. The clock was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock washed over me like a wave as I tapped it with my fingers to see if it was merely stuck. But it refused to begin moving again. Okay, what the actual fuck is going on? I whispered to myself. I reached into my pocket, fishing out my phone and turning on the screen. Like the clock, it, too, showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Craig standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type a text out to Vanessa. "Hey, baby girl. Just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but have gotten a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you." I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want to worry her any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the front right headlight. "Dude, you all right?" I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third calls, I began to feel a new sensation creep up on me, a potent mixture of dread and fear. "Craig, dude, you're creeping me the fuck out. Please say something." He finally turned to look at me, and in the semi-glow of the headlights, I saw his face had gone a bit pale. He raised a finger and pointed, saying only a single word, "Look." My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but, with a gasp, I realized it was the same woman who'd nearly caused me to wreck. "Oh, fuck me sideways, man." I swallowed, finding my voice. We should We should get back in the car, Craig." He nodded almost immediately. "I think you might be right," he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother pulling my seatbelt on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first and floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us, and the car shot forward onto the road. This time, I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot hard down, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed that I would see something, anything ahead of us. An intersection. A house. A freaking out-of-use payphone. For fuck's sake. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us. The exact same one as before, with the sign underneath. My eyes flickered to the clock, and terror shot through me as I saw it still was frozen at the same time. "This isn't good, bro," Craig said from the passenger seat. I agreed with him, but didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turnoff appeared again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, I saw others, the outlines of other people, dozens, possibly more. They all stood facing the road, watching us fly by, and then they disappeared into the rearview mirror. Fuck, I breathed out as the light and sign flashed by yet again. This time, the mass of people had gotten even closer to the road. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. "What the hell do we do?" Craig asked me, his voice steady yet filled with fear, the same I felt. I just shook my head. "I don't know, man," was all I could say. The streetlight began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to nearly slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Craig look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped, told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now, I think I'm going to tell her to call the cops or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look out the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turnoff as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts, demons, whatever they were, had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon as the light began to appear once more. Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment, relief like I'd never felt surged through me at the small bit of normalcy I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me, enough I spoke aloud. "The fuck?" Craig spoke up. "What? What'd she say?" I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to understand. But it was like I was hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me. But again, the same block was coming to me. As it did, a new wave of fear began to rise up in me, one for an entirely new reason than the terrifying loop flying by outside. The speedometer now showed we were doing 90. And then Craig spoke. "Can I ask you a question, man?" Ice filled every vein in my body, not at his question, but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension he'd had not even a minute ago. Now he just sounded flat. No, not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer, my mouth dry as cotton. "What?" he answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. "Are you scared?" For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him, just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated again. My eyes locked with his. The light flew by. The turnoff appeared again, and for a moment my eyes flicked up to see that the woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face. And then I was screaming, my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right. I saw a tree flying towards the windshield. I didn't think. I just forced the door open and leapt out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in a hospital room, a bandage covering my head and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing I saw was Vanessa, who, upon seeing me wake up, burst into tears and wrapped her arm around me. A few moments later, the doctor came in. He told me that I was a lucky man. Apparently, I'd gotten away with only a gash in my head requiring staples, severely bruised ribs, and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. Then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in, and 2 officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what had happened. Well, except for 2 small details anyways. They appeared to take my account seriously and promised to look into it. "We've had some reports similar to yours, sir," one of them answered tentatively. Then they told me how I'd been found, how a father and son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving and had come across first my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree and then lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they'd been, but I had a fair idea who they'd been. At least the son, anyways. That night was 3 months ago. I've been at home, resting and healing this entire time. It's given me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night, about any of it. I feel like I'll go insane if I do, especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck. Only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to after receiving an email from an unknown address. One claiming to be the son, the kid I saw in the gas station that night. He told me things that his father told him he'd seen for years, that he didn't believe at all. Until that night, when he looked out the door at my car. That's when he'd frantically called his father. As I typed this out, I feel myself begin to violently shake, remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost, as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had. Remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be, filled with shark-like teeth as black eyes stared hungrily at me. The same shark-like smile the kid told me he'd been flashed as I'd pulled away. But mostly, I remember the single line of text Vanessa sent me. What caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late-night drives again? The 3 words that will remain burned into my memory forever. Darling. Who's Craig? Last year, I learned a lesson I will never forget. Trust your gut. I had the day off from work. I wanted to do something fun, but everyone I knew was busy. Makes sense. I mean, it was a Tuesday. I decided I'd just go to the amusement park by myself. I've done it before and had a great time. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker. Well, not too much anymore. Going 5 miles over the speed limit is about all the excitement I want out of life anymore. I got to the park at around 2 p.m. It was slow, even for a Tuesday. It gave me a sense of excitement because I knew I'd be able to ride a lot of rides without having to be there all day. At the same time, it gave me a weird, uncanny feeling. All this space and not enough people to fill it up. I ignored the feeling and moved on. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to an amusement park, I like to work my way up to the really crazy rides. I'll start small and finish off the day with my favorite. My favorite just happened to be called the Grim Reaper. It feels a little too on the nose, doesn't it? It was 7:30 p.m. and the park closed at 8 p.m. And I knew it was time to get in line for my final ride. I also made a new friend while there. We met standing in line at one of my first rides of the day. We decided, after chatting the whole time in line, that we'd hang out for the rest of the day. His name was Charlie. We agreed on every ride that day, except for the last. He wanted to end the night on the Mindbinder, but after some convincing, aka the Mindbinder's line was way shorter while passing by, we decided to do the Grim Reaper last. We got in line for the Grim Reaper, and there was hardly anyone in line. It made sense, given that it was almost closing time. Do you think they will let us ride multiple times if the line stays down? Charlie said with his hands clasped excitedly in front of him. I just smiled at him and chuckled. Normally, I would have been excited too, but something in my gut felt so off. For some reason, I didn't want to go on one of my favorite rides. Maybe it was the 5 corn dogs I ate a couple hours earlier, I figured. I'm a very rational person. I wasn't the kind of person to let anxiety or worry rule over me. I always thought life was just what you made of it. When we got in line, there were about 60 people, give or take. The people in front of us did their ride, and 30 of us were left in line. People started looking at the time and saying they were tired and just getting out of line. By the time it was our turn, only 19 people were in line. I knew the ride well enough to remember that it held 20 people, so if no one else got in line, they really might let us go multiple times. I really didn't want that, though. Honestly, I felt even more compelled to get out of line after all those others did too. And I didn't want to seem lame to my new friend if I wanted to get off the coaster after one ride. The time came for us to get on the ride. My heart was pounding faster than it ever had. I wondered if I was all worked up because I watched Final Destination 3 with a friend a couple weeks back. But I wasn't having visions of the terrible fate we would all face. I was just feeling off. I did everything in my power to get it to all make sense and to not worry, but nothing worked. I seriously considered just telling Charlie I didn't feel great after the last ride, but I finally found someone with my taste in roller coasters. I didn't want to let him down. We were towards the back of the line, so we didn't have much say in where we sat. We ended up in the 3rd car from the front. I was just happy we weren't in the front car. As you get on the Grim Reaper, it plays a cheesy little jingle. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Grim Reaper will find you dead or alive. With music in the background that always sounded so dumb in the past. I couldn't believe it was getting to me. Charlie even hummed along to it while grabbing my arm with happiness. We got in our seats, and an employee came by and pulled down the metal bar restraint to secure us in our seats. It was the kind that strapped you individually over your shoulder. I'm on the chubbier side, but I can always fit into coaster seats. I've never been told I couldn't go on a ride. I'm just sometimes a little snug. It's actually kind of nice because I feel very secure. As we got strapped in, I felt the plastic-coated metal hit my shoulders and chest. It should have given me a sense of comfort and safety, but I just felt trapped. The employee walked back to the station that has the infamous big button that starts the ride. He flashed all a thumbs up and yelled, "Ready for the Reaper?" Everyone raised their hands and let out an excited scream. Except for me, I let out a large sigh, counting down the seconds. Trying to imagine Charlie and I once we were off the ride and how happy we would be. The employee hit the button, and we were off. The coaster shot out of the loading station like we were a bullet being shot out of a gun. After that, it started on a relatively slow ascent up a point to a drop-off of 60 degrees, a couple of twists and turns, a big loop, and some more twists and turns. About halfway through the ride, I was enjoying myself. I was thinking about how the hard part was done, and I was safe. Just a little anxiety was all. We were rounding out our last bend when a sense of relief came over me. I could see the end of the ride. I was almost done, but the ride didn't start to slow down. Normally, the coaster starts to slowly come to a full stop several hundred feet from the end, but it was still going. As we passed by the loading area, I saw the operators look confused as we raced by. I noticed no one else was waiting in line. Someone screamed one more time, and everyone on board gave an excited response. Everyone except for me. Charlie looked over at me and grabbed my wrist. Yes, I knew they would let us keep going. This is awesome. He let out an excited yelp as we reached the climb to the drop. He was beaming with joy the whole rest of the lap. We passed by the loading area once again, but this time the coaster operator had a couple other people standing with him. The operator who strapped us looked red and worried. As we were whipped by the employees for our 3rd ride of the day, the other riders were divided. Some were still excited, screaming, "Let's go, one more time," or "Best day ever, yeah!" Some people started to sound scared. Not everyone noticed the employees looking frazzled. I can promise you one thing. I noticed. We started going up the incline again. This was the slowest part of the ride, at around 10 miles per hour and slowing down a little as it reached its peak. This gave us opportunities to take a breath or try to talk, although it was only for a total of about 20 seconds. Are we stuck? I said nervously to Charlie. I'm sure we are fine. There is just a malfunction with the electrical system not activating the brakes or something. There is always a manual shut-off. He was cut off, and we went down the steep hill. We passed by yet again, this time with more people looking worried and someone standing close to where the coaster would go by. He tried to yell at us as we went by, but we couldn't really understand him. Maybe something about them working on getting us off. This time, as we zoomed by, everyone was scared and starting to panic. I guess it didn't sink in for some people what was happening until right now. We went around a 5th time and everything remained the same. On the 6th time, we were at the peak and saw a fire truck coming into the parking lot. From the top of the incline, we had a perfect view of the parking lot, along with the side of a highway a little further out. It took 2 more loops around the track by the time the fire department got to us. Not just them, but police officers and ambulances. It started to scare me. Why did they get ambulances? Is it just protocol, or is there more to this? Someone came in a few minutes later with the big white board that they used to write messages to us. The ride was too loud when passing by them to hear anything, so this was their only way to talk to us. It must have been the 12th or 13th time around when the whiteboard read, "Trying to free you at peak." I knew they couldn't write a novel for us because you can only read so much while going by so fast. But, come on, people, what is that supposed to mean? I think they just wanted to tell us they were working on a way to get us down, but that didn't matter. We had been on this ride for nearly 30 minutes, and we felt sick, and our bodies hurt like crazy. A couple loops after that, we saw a fire truck trying to get underneath where the top of the ascend was. Luckily, there was a large space where the truck could pull right beside it. Unfortunately, at its peak, it's about 200 feet in the air. It also didn't have any emergency exits at the top, like most coasters do. You'd think that would be a requirement, but what do I know? We saw the fire truck start to expand the ladder that comes out the top, but it wasn't even close. We waited for the firefighters to try and figure out a solution to save us, as the audience below us was watching us like we were some kind of show. It was close to 45 minutes when the first death occurred. Then, one more soon after. There was a skinnier guy in a car behind me. I heard him talking about trying to slip out of the seat restraint, which secured him to his seat. The other guy he was with told him it was a bad idea. So did I. The next time we went up the ascent, he began violently wiggling and thrashing back and forth, to the point where people thought he was going to throw off the ride. He managed to wiggle about halfway out, right at the top. But well, it didn't end very well. His leg got caught on a part of the track and yanked the rest of his body out of the bar restraint. It sent his body crashing down towards the earth. However, I think he was dead soon after he was ripped out of his seat. I didn't see too much of it, but the guy who was beside him let out an insane screech. Hearing that kind of agony as you are feeling the harsh effects of gravity hitting on your chest while going down a steep hill was truly mortifying. The screech out of nowhere stopped, and more people screamed. The man beside him had a heart attack. I could hear the symphony of moans and crying coming from the crowd watching us. I couldn't hear them before because of how loud the ride was, but they were terrified of what they saw. Police tried to escort them out of the park, but it didn't stop people from parking on the side of the road to watch and record on their phones. It made me feel disgusted. At around an hour on the ride, everyone stopped screaming or trying to talk to each other. It seemed like everyone accepted their fate. My nails were deeply embedded into Charlie's wrist. I couldn't scream anymore due to my throat feeling raw from the yelling. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't due to my voice giving out. I saw that I drew a little blood on Charlie, but he was too out of it to notice. He, along with a few other people, were incredibly sick. He threw up probably 5 times by this point and looked cross-eyed. Around that time, the electricity in the whole park shut down. All the lights, everything. I think they were hoping a hard reboot of the whole park would stop the ride. The coaster didn't just rely on gravity, but also on a lot of help from motors and other electronic elements. It all turned off when we were on the straightaway. Of course, it still didn't stop. I could hear someone yelling with frustration, not understanding how it could still be moving if it didn't have an electrical source. After 2 hours, they let some family members come into the loading area, which was a terrible idea. We were doing our best to keep cool and stay calm, our families washing us, zooming by them every 2 minutes, and absolutely screaming at us made it so much worse. My mom was my first family member to show up. Don't get me wrong, I love my mom, but she's very stubborn and wanted something done even though they had already tried everything. Of course, it was just because she wanted me safe, but it was stressing me out. The firefighters put down a safety net underneath the ascent. It was still quite a jump if we could even get out successfully to land on it, and we might be okay, but we were all a little scarred from what happened before. It seemed like they put it out just in case someone tried to get out again. It didn't seem like it was the plan to have us all just jump out of that moving death machine. They weren't desperate enough at that point. We saw a large group of people passionately arguing and yelling at each other. From what I could tell, it was made up of family members, firefighters, and some employees of the park. I'm sure with lots of varying opinions. The ride was on hour 3. When the coaster entered the loading area once again, I saw a woman run over to the control panel. A couple people ran over to her and told her to stop and not press the button. She was screaming her head off and wailing. It had been hard to understand people in the past while going by them, but this was as clear as day. As we passed by, I could tell she was starting to break free from the grip of people holding her back. I wasn't too worried. Whatever button she was wanting to press, I'm sure it wouldn't work since none of the other ones worked so far. We were about 5 seconds away from going down the descent when we heard a click come from all our seats. The woman hit the button that unlocked all our overhead seat belts. Of course, the seatbelt button worked, but not the button to stop the ride. A few people reacted fast enough to either jump out or snap it back over themselves before the ride went down. Others weren't so lucky. 3 people managed to jump out, but didn't survive the fall. Despite there now being a giant net to catch anyone who was dumb enough to try and get out that high, one person hit a support beam on the way down, and the other 2 landed wrong when they hit the net. Their bodies folded in an unnatural manner as they hit. All 3 died instantly. I would say around half of us that were left managed to get the seatbelt secured before going down the hill. Everyone else had to hold on for dear life. And unfortunately, I was one of them. I felt my stomach start to drop as I reached up to grab the only thing that would keep me from becoming a part of the pavement below. The restraint wasn't completely useless at this point. I just had a good 12 inches in between my chest and the restraint. As I dug my fingers into the plastic, I hoped I would be fine. Then the ride dropped. I felt my butt lift off the seat I had become so familiar with. I tried to wrap my ankles around the floor of the coaster to keep the rest of my body from flying out. Charlie luckily got the restraint down, so he was trying to get his leg over mine and hold me down with his arm. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, I managed to pull it back down over my chest. I wasn't sure who else got theirs down, but I assumed, from how scared a few of them sounded, it wasn't good. All I could think about and look at was the big loop coming up. As we got closer, I could hear swearing from multiple passengers, including someone in front of me. She was violently pulling at the restraint, but it just wasn't budging. I was hoping and praying that the centrifugal force would keep her in her seat. As we went around the big loop, I closed my eyes. I knew I didn't want to see what was about to happen. I heard multiple people screaming and making horrendous cracking sounds. I don't have an exact number, but I would say only 7 people were left. I could see the 2 people in the very front row and Charlie beside me. I recall only hearing 3 other voices behind me at this point. At hour 5, 3 more people died while on the ride. 2 of them from a heart attack or something. The 3rd person, Well, he watched the person beside him suddenly die while going around one of the bends. He yelled out in anger, and well, I'd actually rather not go into detail, but he died soon after. I saw the whole thing. They were the two people left in front of me and Charlie. At hour 6, we saw a group of people bringing in what looked like another large net, except that it was in the loading area. The next time we looped around, they wrote something new on the big whiteboard. We are going to try and stop it manually. I had no clue what this meant, but by the look of the net, I was terrified. The next pass, there were people on both sides of the loading area. On one side, the net was wrapped around a large pole that had been somehow fastened into the concrete slab. I saw a large, similar pole on the other side, but the net wasn't yet attached. As we zoomed by, I could hear people trying to rush and hurry behind us. We went around one of the turns, and I cranked my neck, looking to see what plan they had in mind. They were frantically trying to tie the other side of the net to the support beam that was freshly drilled into the ground. I couldn't believe how stupid these people were. How on earth did they think this was a good idea? Was this a last-ditch attempt? I was yelling at them and telling them to stop, but of course they couldn't hear me. Even if they could, they wouldn't listen. They were desperate to get at least someone out of this alive, or maybe the owner of the park wanted all of us to die so that no one could publicly talk about the horrific things we went through. As we went past the last bend, the hundreds of people watching the spectacle cheered, clapped, and celebrated. Somehow, not seeing any of the flaws with this terrible plan. We were on the straightaway, and my heart started to pound again. The few seconds before we hit the net felt like slow motion. I swore I could see everyone's face. They looked happy. I couldn't believe it. It made me upset because I knew they were all about to be very disappointed. Finally, we hit the net. Of course, it was no match for a giant metal contraption hitting it. The metal pole was ripped out of the concrete slab and smashed down right in between our car and the one behind us. As we headed for the incline, we tried to get the net that attached itself to us off of the coaster. Luckily, we were able to get it off of us, but no luck with the metal beam that was now awkwardly lodged in the coaster. As we started going down, the whole ride started to shake violently. It felt like we were going to fly off the track. We made it to the first turn. I heard a loud snap and 2 screams. The 7 coaster cars behind ours broke off, and the metal beam found its way underneath. As we turned, I watched in disbelief as the cars behind us all went flying off the tracks. At that point in the ride, it was about 50 feet off the ground, still enough to kill them. I wasn't fast enough to close my eyes and saw the whole thing. It went off the track like it had wings and suddenly plummeted down into the earth. The screaming immediately stopped when the ride landed upside down. My imagination filled in the blanks and shuddered at the thought of the carnage below me. And then there were 2. We were hoping that somehow the ride would stop or slow down because we lost the back 7 cars. I was not sure what the logic was, but we were desperate at this point. After another hour, it was not showing any signs of slowing down. Once we made it to hour 8, we expected our fate. I was hoping that this would all be over soon and we could just be done. I don't think either one of us thought we'd get off. We just hoped, at this point, that our deaths would be quick. Over the next couple hours, we noticed a piece of metal on the car ahead of us start to wobble and loosen. I'm not sure if it was just the wear and tear of the ride going for so long or the whole net fiasco. It kept looking like it was about to come loose, and we'd duck out of the way. We were imagining the worst possible outcome, thinking it would fly off and decapitate one of us. Eventually, it did come off. But it wasn't a dramatic moment like we thought it would be. It was so much worse. Instead of coming all the way off, it only partially came off and started grinding loudly against the track. We heard an audible cringing sound from everyone watching below. The sound was horrendous. The thin strip of metal started to find its way underneath the car. Charlie was worried it would dislodge the coaster from its tracks like we saw just hours before. He told me he was going to try and grab it. I begged him not to. After a few laps of me telling him to just leave it, he made up his mind and contorted his body to try and grab the sharp metal. I couldn't see his hand as he reached down for it, but I could see his face. Somehow, that made it worse. His expression quickly changed from focused to shocked in a matter of seconds. His face was blank. I heard screaming, but had no clue what was going on. He lifted up his arm and I don't think I will ever be able to get the image of what used to be his arm out of my head. When he gripped the metal, it slipped and went deep into his forearm. I tried to grab his shoulder to calm him down, but to my shock, he was calm. He was more silent at that moment than he had been the whole day. He wouldn't even look at me. He was almost mesmerized by the sight of his bloody, disfigured arm. I felt lightheaded and had a ringing in my ears. Watching the blood start to make its way down his entire body, then to me and the floor of the coaster. It was making me feel sick watching the blood move around the car as we went around the twists and turns of the ride. Within minutes, Charlie looked like a ghost. I did my best to try and wrap his arm up with shreds of my shirt, but it was completely pointless. I don't think an old t-shirt can help when you see the bone. I tried to talk to him. I tried to make him feel as comfortable as I could, but it was no use. He was fading in and out of consciousness. We began going up the ascent, and he finally looked over at me. I couldn't begin to explain all that I saw in his eyes. I could see the pain and sadness, but also the relief. He knew he was going to die. But I don't think he cared. He gave me a weak nod of the head and looked ahead when we went down the hill. I tried to keep a close eye on him this lap, but it was honestly hard to look at him. I heard him take a deep breath right before the loop. When we finished the loop, I looked over at him and, well, he was gone. I was now left alone in the death trap. I never imagined it could have gotten any worse. But having a dead body sitting next to you on a roller coaster is not something I would recommend. I was sitting in shock next to my dead friend for a couple hours. I was frozen in fear, not wanting to even think of a way out. After gaining some courage, I contemplated my next move. I came back into reality and realized the coaster was going just slightly slower. It wasn't significant, but if the loops were taking just slightly longer than before, that damn piece of metal that killed Charlie must have made its way underneath and not derailed it, but slowed it down. I ended up taking off my shoes and Charlie's shoes. I had a plan that was probably dumb, but if I died, at least it would be in my hands. As I went by the loading area, the coaster started to slow down just before the ascent. I threw all 4 shoes right in front of the ride. A part of a shoe caught the truck in just the right spot. The ride was still. I could feel the coaster almost pulsing, trying to move with all its might. I was sore. My shoulders were badly buried by the shoulder restraints, repeatedly hitting me over and over again. My whole lower half aching from sitting in a hard seat for hours on hours. I took a deep breath and squeezed in my gut like I never had before. I let out a horrific yell as I forced my body out of the restraint that had been holding me down for the last 12 hours. About 360 times around the track. My heart was racing as I felt the coaster start to win the battle to move again. I managed to squeeze out just seconds before it took off. I was freed and jumped. Luckily, I just barely hit the net below. I also managed to hit the net, so I didn't hurt myself too badly. Nothing is worse than what that ride already did to me. I laid on the net, looking up into the sky. In disbelief, I was still. I wasn't moving. It was almost making me feel motion sick, not moving around. Like when you are reading a book in the car and you look up after an hour. Everything was blurry. I could barely hear the faint sound of people trying to get to me. But it was mostly just my ears ringing and my heart beating. After just a few minutes, I was down. They immediately rushed me to the ER, where I stayed for 3 weeks. I sustained a broken rib, a broken collarbone, severe bruising, and a concussion, just to name a few. Not to mention the mental trauma. I'm writing this as I'm feeling ready to finally tell my story. This is the first time I'm digging back into my memories and recollecting the whole experience. I've started to work through all this with a therapist, and it's made me realize I need to get it all out of my system. Don't bother trying to find anything about this story. The owners of the park have done a suspiciously good job hiding it. That's another reason I want to get my story out there. They have completely scrubbed the internet of it somehow. Although talking with a professional has helped, there are still some sounds and images that I can just never completely get out of my head. If you take one thing from my story, it's that you should trust yourself. Even if you don't believe in a higher power or gut instincts, if you have a feeling, trust it. Please.